May 26th, 1941, 7:47 p.m., North Atlantic Ocean, 600 miles west of Brest, France. The Bismarck, the most powerful warship Nazi Germany had ever built, was limping through violent seas at 28 knots. On the bridge, Admiral Gunther Lutyens stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the gray horizon. For 3 days, the British had hunted him across the Atlantic. For 3 days, he had evaded their cruisers, their battleships, their entire home fleet. He was now less than 16 hours from reaching the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air cover. And then, through the rain and mist, he saw them. 15 fabric-covered biplanes, looking like relics from the previous war, emerged from the clouds. Their fixed landing gear hung below open cockpits. Their maximum speed was barely 138 miles per hour. They were Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, aircraft so obsolete that German sailors had a nickname for them: stringbags. Admiral Lutyens watched them approach with something close to contempt. He had read the intelligence reports. He knew what every naval strategist in Berlin believed: that carrier-based torpedo aircraft posed no serious threat to modern battleships. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft batteries could shred those canvas-covered wings in seconds. What Lutyens didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that in the next 11 minutes, one of those ancient biplanes would seal his fate, condemn his crew, and change the course of naval warfare forever. But how did the most technologically advanced battleship in the world end up at the mercy of aircraft that belonged in a museum? To understand that, we need to go back 4 days, to the moment when everything started to unravel. If you're finding this story gripping, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more stories like this one. Now, let's continue. May 18th, 1941. The naval base at Gotenhafen in occupied Poland. The morning air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of diesel fuel and salt water. Crews scrambled across the decks of 2 massive warships preparing for departure. Operation Rheinübung, the Rhine exercise, was about to begin. The Bismarck displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 15-inch guns arranged in 4 turrets, capable of hurling 1,800-pound shells over 20 miles. Her armor belt was nearly 13 inches thick. Her propulsion system, 12 Wagner boilers driving 3 turbines, could push her through the water at over 30 knots. Standing on the deck that morning was 22-year-old Matrosengefighter Bruno Rezonka, a loader in one of the secondary battery turrets. He had written to his mother in Cologne just 2 days before, describing the Bismarck as unsinkable. That word would later haunt the families of 2,000 sailors. Beside the Bismarck was the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, 8 inches shorter in main armament but fast and modern. Together they represented the sharp edge of the Kriegsmarine's surface fleet, Admiral Erich Raeder's answer to British naval dominance. The mission was straightforward in concept but audacious in execution. Break out into the North Atlantic, avoid the British home fleet, and systematically destroy Allied merchant convoys. Britain, an island nation, depended on those convoys for survival. Food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, everything came by sea. Strangle the convoys and you strangle Britain. Admiral Lutyens, commanding the task force from the Bismarck's flag bridge, understood both the potential and the risk. At 52 years old, he was a career naval officer with a reputation for caution and meticulous planning. He had successfully commanded the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in raids earlier that year, sinking 22 ships totaling over 115,000 tons. But Lutyens harbored doubts about this mission. In a private meeting with Admiral Raeder before departure, he had argued for delaying until the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was ready for service. 2 battleships would be far more effective than one. Raeder refused. Hitler was impatient. The operation would proceed. There was another concern that Lutyens kept largely to himself. British radar technology had improved dramatically. Their reconnaissance aircraft now carried airborne search radar. And the Royal Navy had something else: aircraft carriers operating in the North Atlantic. Lutyens dismissed this last threat. The British carriers were equipped with Swordfish, biplanes designed in the early 1930s. Their torpedo attacks required approaching within a few hundred yards of the target at speeds slow enough to track with optical gun sights. Against the Bismarck's 105 anti-aircraft guns, such an attack would be suicide. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong, but not yet. The breakout began on May 19th. The 2 German ships slipped through the Kattegat, hugging the Norwegian coast, hiding in fjords during daylight to avoid British reconnaissance. On May 21st, they anchored briefly near Bergen, where they were spotted by a British Spitfire on a photo reconnaissance mission. The photographs reached the Admiralty in London within hours. The reaction was immediate and electric. First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound studied the images in silence. The intelligence staff had identified the ships correctly: Bismarck and Prinz Eugen. The largest German warship ever built was loose in the Atlantic approaches. Pound understood exactly what that meant. A single raider of the Bismarck's capability could devastate convoy operations. The British had learned this lesson painfully in the previous war, when German surface raiders had tied down dozens of Royal Navy ships in fruitless searches. But the Bismarck was far more powerful than any previous raider. She could outgun any British ship except the battlecruiser Hood and the new battleship Prince of Wales, and she could outrun both. The British response began immediately. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding the battlecruiser force, was ordered to intercept the Germans in the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Iceland and Greenland. His flagship was HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy. The Hood was a legend. Commissioned in 1920, she had been the largest warship in the world for 20 years. Her sleek lines and massive guns, 8 15-inch weapons, had made her a symbol of British naval power. She had shown the flag in ports around the globe, reminding the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. But the Hood had a secret weakness that few outside the naval engineering community understood. Her deck armor was inadequate against plunging fire, shells falling at steep angles from long range. The ship had been designed before the lessons of Jutland were fully absorbed, and planned modernizations had been repeatedly postponed due to budget constraints. Vice Admiral Holland knew about this vulnerability. His tactical plan accounted for it. He would close the range as quickly as possible, minimizing the time the Hood spent under long-range fire, where her deck armor was most vulnerable. But plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. May 23, 1941, the Denmark Strait. 800 miles of gray, heaving water between the ice fields of Greenland and the volcanic shores of Iceland. Visibility was poor. Fog banks drifted across the sea, broken by occasional squalls of sleet and rain. At 7:22 p.m., the heavy cruiser HMS Suffolk, patrolling the strait with her sister ship Norfolk, made radar contact with the German ships. The operators stared at their screens in disbelief. The blips were huge. This was no false echo. Suffolk's captain, Robert Ellis, immediately transmitted the contact report. Within minutes, it had reached Admiral Holland aboard the Hood, 280 miles to the south. The pursuit began. Holland pushed his ships hard through the night. Hood, Prince of Wales, and their escorting destroyers racing north at 28 knots. The seas were rough, waves crashing over the forecastles, but there was no time to ease the pace. Every hour of delay gave the Germans another chance to slip away into the vast Atlantic. On the Bismarck, Admiral Lutyens knew he had been spotted. The British cruisers were shadowing him at the edge of radar range, their contact reports pinpointing his position for the forces converging from all directions. He considered turning back, fighting through the cruisers, and returning to Norway. Instead, he pressed on. The Atlantic was so close. Once through the Denmark Strait, he would have thousands of miles of open ocean in which to disappear. The convoy routes beckoned like wounded prey. That decision, to continue rather than retreat, would be debated by naval historians for decades. Some argue it was the right call, that Lutyens came within hours of success. Others believe he should have recognized the trap closing around him. What is certain is that at 5:35 a.m. on May 24, 1941, the lookouts on both sides spotted each other simultaneously. The morning was gray and cold, with visibility around 12 miles. Aboard the Hood, Vice Admiral Holland stood on the compass platform, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the haze, he could just make out two dark shapes on the horizon. After 14 hours of pursuit, contact at last. "Enemy in sight," the signal lamp flashed to Prince of Wales. "Prepare for action." The Hood's crew had been at action stations since before dawn. Now, as the range closed, the great ship came alive with purpose. In the forward turrets, loading crews wrestled 1,800-pound shells into the hoists. In the plotting room, officers calculated firing solutions. On the bridge, Holland weighed his options. The Germans had the positional advantage. They were to the north, silhouetted against the lighter sky, while the British ships approached from the south, their gray hulls blending into the darker horizon. Lutyens could see his enemies clearly. Holland was squinting into the gloom. More critically, the angle of approach meant that only the British forward turrets could bear on the target. The Hood and Prince of Wales together had 16 15-inch and 10 14-inch guns, but at this angle, only half could fire. The Germans faced no such limitation. At 5:52 a.m., at a range of approximately 25,000 yards, Holland gave the order to open fire. The Hood's forward turrets erupted in flame and smoke, the concussion rolling across the water like thunder. 8 seconds later, the shells splashed into the sea near the Prince Eugen. Holland had mistaken the cruiser for the Bismarck in the poor visibility. The error was corrected, but precious seconds had been lost. The Germans returned fire immediately. Bismarck's gunnery officer, Adalbert Schneider, had already calculated the range and bearing. The first salvo was a straddle, shells landing on both sides of the Hood. close enough to drench her deck with spray. On the Hood's bridge, Holland ordered a turn to port, a maneuver that would bring the aft turrets into action while also presenting a smaller target. The great ship began to heel as her rudder bit into the water. She never completed the turn. At 6 a.m., a shell from the Bismarck's fifth salvo struck the Hood near the mainmast. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. The shell penetrated the deck and detonated in or near the aft magazine, where hundreds of tons of cordite propellant were stored. The explosion was volcanic. A column of flame shot 1,000 feet into the air, followed by a mushroom cloud of smoke and debris that could be seen from 30 miles away. The Hood broke in two, her bow and stern rising briefly toward the sky before plunging into the freezing water. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. On the Bismarck, the crew watched in stunned silence. They had just destroyed the most famous warship in the world in a matter of minutes. The cheering began slowly, then spread through the ship in a wave of euphoria. But Admiral Lutyens did not cheer. He stood on the bridge, face expressionless, watching the oil slick and debris that marked the Hood's grave. He understood what the British did not yet fully grasp. This battle was far from over. The Prince of Wales was still fighting. Though hit 7 times and suffering from mechanical problems with her main turrets, she was so new that civilian contractors were still aboard. She had scored 2 hits on the Bismarck. One of those hits would prove decisive. A 14-inch shell had struck the Bismarck below the waterline, forward on the port side. The damage seemed minor at first, some flooding, a slight list, nothing the pumps couldn't handle. But the shell had also ruptured fuel tanks, causing the Bismarck to leak oil and lose access to 1,000 tons of fuel stored in the forward compartments. Lutyens ordered a damage assessment. The engineering officer's report was sobering. The ship could no longer reach the planned operational speed without risking further flooding. The fuel situation meant that the original mission, a sustained raiding operation in the Atlantic, was no longer feasible. The Admiral faced a choice. He could continue into the Atlantic with reduced capabilities, or he could abandon the mission and make for a friendly port. He chose a middle path, detached the Prince Eugen to conduct independent raiding operations, while the Bismarck made for the French port of Saint-Nazaire for repairs. That decision revealed his position to every British ship within radio range. The hunting began in earnest. The British deployed everything they had: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers. From Scapa Flow came King George V and the carrier Victorious. From Gibraltar steamed Force H, including the battlecruiser Renown and the carrier Ark Royal. Cruisers and destroyers scattered across the North Atlantic like a net, waiting for the Bismarck to swim into their grasp. And then disaster struck. May 25th, 3:06 a.m. The Suffolk, which had been shadowing the Bismarck since the Denmark Strait, lost contact. One moment, the massive ship was there on the radar screen. The next, she had vanished. At the Admiralty in London, the mood shifted from determination to near panic. The most dangerous ship in the German Navy had disappeared into the vast Atlantic. If she escaped, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just the ships she might sink, but the strategic impact. Convoys would have to be suspended or rerouted, escorts reinforced, the entire Atlantic supply line thrown into chaos. For the next 31 hours, the British searched blindly. Aircraft flew grid patterns through rain and fog. Ships steamed in widening arcs, their radar operators staring at empty screens. Nothing. What had happened? Lutyens had executed a brilliantly simple maneuver. Instead of continuing southwest toward the Atlantic convoy routes, he had turned sharply southeast, passing behind his pursuers and opening the range while they searched in the wrong direction. But then Lutyens made a mistake that would cost him his ship and the lives of most of his crew. At 9:01 a.m. on May 25th, convinced that the British had already detected his course change, Lutyens transmitted a lengthy radio message to Naval Group West headquarters in Paris. The message ran for over 30 minutes, providing a detailed report on the Denmark Strait battle and his current intentions. British direction-finding stations intercepted the transmission immediately. The signal was triangulated. Within hours, the Admiralty knew approximately where the Bismarck was, and more importantly, where she was heading. She was making for France. This revelation changed everything. The British forces that had been searching the western Atlantic were now racing eastward, converging on the Bay of Biscay. But time was desperately short. If the Bismarck reached the protective umbrella of Luftwaffe air cover, Focke-Wulf Condors and Junkers 88s operating from French bases, the British surface ships would have to turn back. Germany's most powerful warship would escape. The only hope was to slow her down. May 26th, 10:30 a.m. A Catalina flying boat of Coastal Command, piloted by an American officer serving with the Royal Navy, technically a violation of United States neutrality, spotted the Bismarck through a gap in the clouds. The sighting report electrified the British fleet. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the pursuit from the battleship King George V, studied the chart with growing concern. The Bismarck was approximately 130 miles ahead of him, steaming at 20 knots. His own ships were low on fuel after days of high-speed pursuit. At the current closure rate, the Germans would reach air cover before he could bring them to action, unless something slowed them down. Tovey's gaze shifted to another symbol on the chart. HMS Ark Royal, the fleet carrier of Force H, approaching from the south. She carried Swordfish torpedo bombers, the same obsolete biplanes that naval strategists had dismissed as ineffective against modern warships. They were the only chance. Aboard the Ark Royal, the Swordfish crews received their orders with a mixture of determination and dread. They understood the mission: fly through gale-force winds and anti-aircraft fire to deliver torpedo attacks against the most heavily armed ship in the German Navy. The weather was appalling: 40-knot winds, driving rain, visibility measured in hundreds of yards. The Ark Royal was pitching so violently that waves were breaking over her flight deck. The first strike launched at 2:50 p.m. 15 Swordfish struggled into the air, their fabric-covered wings flexing in the gusts. They flew for nearly 2 hours through the storm, navigating by dead reckoning, their crews soaked and frozen in their open cockpits. And then they found a ship. The attack commenced immediately. Torpedoes dropped into the churning sea. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air. The pilots pressed home their assault with desperate courage. And every torpedo missed. Worse than that, they had attacked the wrong ship. In the poor visibility and confusion, the Swordfish had mistaken HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been shadowing the Bismarck, for their actual target. Only a miracle: faulty magnetic detonators that caused the torpedoes to explode prematurely prevented a catastrophic friendly fire incident. The Swordfish limped back to Ark Royal, their crews exhausted and demoralized. The armorers immediately began stripping out the faulty magnetic detonators and replacing them with contact pistols. There would be a second strike. It had to work. There was no third chance. At 7:10 p.m., the second wave of Swordfish began launching from Ark Royal's heaving deck. This time, there were 15 aircraft, led by Lieutenant Commander Tim Coode. The weather had not improved. If anything, the storm was intensifying. Cloud base was down to 600 feet, visibility less than a mile. The crews knew what they faced. The Bismarck's anti-aircraft armament included 16 4.1-inch heavy flak guns, 16 37mm automatic cannons, and dozens of 20mm weapons. The sky around the ship would become a wall of steel. But they also knew what failure meant. If the Bismarck escaped, she would refit in France and return to the Atlantic. The convoys that sustained Britain would face a threat they could not survive. This was not just a battle. This was the war itself, compressed into a single moment. The Swordfish droned through the murk, their three-man crews, pilot, observer, and telegraphist air gunner, searching for the enemy through rain-streaked goggles. At approximately 8:47 p.m., they found her. The Bismarck emerged from a rain squall like a leviathan, her massive superstructure wreathed in spray and gun smoke. She was turning hard to port, presenting her beam to the approaching aircraft, her anti-aircraft batteries already thundering. The Swordfish pilots pushed over into their attack runs. Standard doctrine called for approaching at around 50 feet above the water, releasing the torpedo at close range, then banking away before the ship's guns could track you. It was a technique developed in peacetime exercises. No one had tried it against a battleship that was shooting back. The first aircraft came in from the port beam. Tracers filled the air around it, green and red streams of fire that seemed to reach out with malevolent purpose. The pilot held his course, waiting for the range to close, waiting until he could see the individual gun crews on the Bismarck's deck. At 800 yards, he released. The torpedo splashed into the sea, its propellers spinning to life, beginning its deadly run toward the target. The Swordfish banked hard right, shells bursting all around it, and somehow, impossibly, flew through the barrage without being hit. More aircraft followed. The attack became a confused swirl of biplanes, spray, and fire. Torpedoes entered the water from multiple angles. The Bismarck twisted and turned, her helm hard over, trying to comb the torpedo tracks, to present her narrow bow instead of her vulnerable beam. Most of the torpedoes missed. Some ran off course. Others passed harmlessly ahead or astern as the Bismarck maneuvered. One struck the armored belt amidships and exploded without effect. The blast dispersed across 13 inches of Krupp-cemented steel. But at 9:05 p.m., as the attack was winding down and the surviving Swordfish were beginning their withdrawal, a single torpedo found its mark. The aircraft was piloted by Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, a 21-year-old from Kelso, Scotland. He had come in low from the starboard quarter, so close to the water that spray from the waves was striking his wings. The Bismarck filled his windscreen, impossibly huge, her guns flashing. He released his torpedo at a range of approximately 900 yards. The torpedo ran true. It struck the Bismarck on the starboard side, aft, near the waterline. But this was not just any hit. By a chance that changed history, the torpedo detonated against the Bismarck's steering gear, jamming her twin rudders 15 degrees to port. On the bridge, Admiral Lutyens felt the impact and demanded a damage report. When it came, he understood immediately that his ship was doomed. The Bismarck could no longer steer. With her rudders jammed, she could only turn in circles. The engines, no matter how they were adjusted, could not compensate for the asymmetric drag. The most powerful warship in the German Navy had been reduced to a cripple, unable to flee, unable to fight effectively, circling helplessly in the Atlantic darkness, while the British fleet closed in for the kill. Lutyens sent a message to Naval Group West. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal with every aircraft accounted for. An incredible achievement, given the intensity of the anti-aircraft fire. Several planes had been badly damaged. One had over 170 holes in its fabric covering. But none had been shot down. The Germans, accustomed to aiming at aircraft flying 3 or 4 times as fast, had consistently led their targets too much. The old biplanes had survived through sheer obsolescence. That night, while the Bismarck wallowed in the heavy seas, British destroyers closed in to harry her. 5 ships of the 4th Destroyer Flotilla, Cossack, Sikh, Maori, Zulu, and Pioran, attacked repeatedly through the darkness, launching torpedoes and illuminating the crippled battleship with star shells. The Bismarck fought back with everything she had. Her main battery fired at the darting destroyers, the muzzle flashes lighting up the night like lightning. Her secondary guns and anti-aircraft weapons added to the cacophony. For hours, the sea around her was a chaos of explosions, gunfire, and screaming shells. But the destroyers were too fast, too maneuverable, too numerous to stop. Their torpedoes kept the exhausted German crew at action stations, denying them rest, wearing them down for the battle they knew was coming with the dawn. Below decks, in compartments filling with oily water, the Bismarck's sailors endured the longest night of their lives. Some wrote letters to their families that would never be sent. Others prayed. Many simply sat in numb silence, listening to the impacts against the hull, knowing that each hour brought them closer to the end. Senior Matresengef writer Karl Schmid, a gunner from Munich, later described that night in testimony given after his rescue. "We knew we would not see home again. The ship could not move. The British were all around us. We were trapped like an animal waiting to be slaughtered." Some of the younger men cried. The older ones told them to stop, that we would die as German sailors should. But I think we were all afraid. On the bridge, Admiral Lutyens remained at his post. He had commanded the Bismarck for less than a week, but he would not leave her now. When his chief of staff suggested that the Admiral transfer to a destroyer to continue the fight elsewhere, Lutyens refused. "I will share the fate of this ship," he said. "There is no other choice." May 27th, 1941. Dawn came gray and cold, the sea still running high from the overnight storms. The survivors would later describe the morning as apocalyptic, heavy clouds pressing down on the water, visibility shifting from a few hundred yards to several miles as rain squalls swept through. At 8:47 a.m., the British battle line opened fire. King George V and Rodney approached from the northwest, their massive silhouettes emerging from the mist. Rodney, an older design with all 9 of her 16-inch guns mounted forward, was the first to fire. The shells arced across the sky, each one weighing over 2,000 pounds, traveling at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. The first salvos fell short, sending columns of water climbing into the air. The British spotters adjusted their aim. The second and third salvos began to find their mark. The Bismarck returned fire, her forward turrets erupting in tongues of flame. But without the ability to maneuver, she was reduced to a static target. Her first salvos were close. One shell passed between King George Thuffer's bridge and forward funnel, but she could not maintain the accuracy that had destroyed the hood just 3 days before. The British pressed their advantage without mercy. From ranges as close as 3,000 yards, they poured fire into the crippled battleship. 16-inch shells from Rodney smashed through the superstructure, destroying the bridge, the fire control systems, the secondary batteries. King George V added her own salvos, methodical and relentless. On the Bismarck, the destruction was absolute. The forward turrets were silenced within 20 minutes. The rangefinders were destroyed. The fire control system was wrecked. Fires burned throughout the ship, fed by ruptured fuel lines and exploding ammunition. But the hull would not sink. Despite taking dozens of direct hits from the largest naval guns in the British inventory, the Bismarck remained afloat. Her designers had built her to survive punishment that would have destroyed any other ship. The armored citadel protecting her machinery spaces was holding. Water was pouring in through 1,000 holes, but the pumps, those that still functioned, were keeping pace. The British commanders faced a dilemma. Their ships were critically low on fuel after days of high-speed pursuit. They could not remain on station much longer, and yet the Bismarck, though burning and broken, would not go down. Admiral Tovey ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to close in and finish the job with torpedoes. Dorsetshire approached the stricken battleship from point-blank range. Her first torpedo struck the starboard side, then 2 more from the port side. Finally, at 10:39 a.m., the Bismarck rolled slowly to port and disappeared beneath the waves. Of the 2,220 men who had sailed from Gotenhafen 8 days earlier, only 116 survived. They were pulled from the freezing water by British ships before a submarine alarm cut the rescue short, leaving hundreds to die of exposure in the North Atlantic. Admiral Lutjens was not among the survivors. Neither was the ship's captain, Ernst Lindemann, nor most of the officers and crew. They went down with their ship, taking with them the secrets of what had happened in those final chaotic hours. But the story of the Bismarck's end is not merely a tale of naval combat. It is a story about assumptions, about the dangerous certainty that new technology makes old methods obsolete. The admirals in Berlin had believed that aircraft could not threaten modern battleships. They had seen the statistics, the slow speed of torpedo bombers, the difficulty of hitting a maneuvering ship, the vulnerability of fabric-covered aircraft to anti-aircraft fire. The numbers supported their conclusion. The Swordfish was a relic of the previous war, barely capable of exceeding the speed of a modern automobile. But war does not always conform to statistics. The Swordfish pilots who attacked the Bismarck on the evening of May 26th were not constrained by German assumptions about what was possible. They flew through a storm that should have grounded them. They pressed home attacks against a wall of anti-aircraft fire that should have destroyed them. And one of them, a 21-year-old sub-lieutenant who had never dropped a torpedo in combat before, placed his weapon with such precision that it changed the outcome of the war. John Moffett would survive the war and live until 2016, dying at the age of 97. He never claimed to know for certain that his torpedo was the one that hit the rudder. In the chaos of the attack, with multiple aircraft releasing weapons within seconds of each other, precise attribution was impossible. But the historical consensus points to his aircraft as the one that delivered the fatal blow. In his memoir, published years later, Moffett reflected on that moment with characteristic humility. "I did my job. That's all any of us did. The ship needed to be stopped, so we stopped it. We didn't think about being heroes. We just thought about getting close enough to drop our fish and getting home in one piece." That modesty obscures the magnitude of what was accomplished. The Swordfish attack on the Bismarck was one of the most consequential aerial torpedo strikes in history. It demonstrated, once and for all, that aircraft could neutralize the most powerful surface combatants ever built. The lessons learned would be applied just 7 months later on the opposite side of the world, when Japanese torpedo bombers devastated the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Germans drew their own conclusions from the loss of the Bismarck. Hitler, who had never been enthusiastic about major surface ship operations, became even more risk-averse. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, her mere existence tying down British forces but never venturing into open combat. The era of the battleship as the dominant weapon of naval warfare was ending, superseded by the aircraft carrier that the Bismarck's admirals had dismissed as a fantasy. But there is another dimension to this story, the human dimension that no strategic analysis can fully capture. On both sides of the engagement, young men faced impossible choices with courage that defies easy explanation. The Swordfish crews who launched into that storm knew the odds against them. The German sailors who fought through the night and into the morning of May 27th knew they were doomed. Neither side surrendered to despair. Among the 116 survivors pulled from the water was a young seaman named Herbert Manthey. He had joined the Kriegsmarine at 18, seeking adventure and glory. What he found instead was the freezing Atlantic, the screams of drowning men, and the random chance that placed him near a life raft when so many others were not. Manthey spent 6 hours in the water before being rescued. He later described watching the Bismarck sink. She went down slowly, rolling to her side like a tired animal. I had loved that ship. We all had. She was our home, our world. And then she was gone, and there was only the cold and the bodies floating everywhere and the sound of men calling for help that would never come. The survivors were taken to Britain as prisoners of war. Most spent the remainder of the conflict in camps in Canada or the United Kingdom, listening to radio reports of battles they could no longer fight. They learned of Stalingrad, of Normandy, of the final collapse of the Reich. They returned to a Germany in ruins, their youth spent in camps, their shipmates buried in 2,000 fathoms of Atlantic water. The wreck of the Bismarck was located in 1989 by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic 4 years earlier. The ship lies upright on the seafloor at a depth of over 15,000 feet, her hull largely intact. The turrets, which broke free during the sinking, are scattered around the wreck site. Debris fields extend for hundreds of meters in all directions. Ballard's expedition revealed something unexpected. The Bismarck's hull showed relatively little damage below the waterline. The massive holes punched by British shells and torpedoes were concentrated in the superstructure. This discovery supported the accounts of German survivors who claimed that the crew had scuttled the ship to prevent capture, opening the seacocks and detonating charges in the lower hull. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The ship was already mortally wounded when the scuttling charges detonated. Whether she would have sunk from battle damage alone or lingered for hours until the sea finally claimed her is a question that cannot be definitively answered. What can be answered is the question of legacy. The loss of the Bismarck was a devastating blow to German naval prestige and strategic planning. The Kriegsmarine's dream of a fleet capable of challenging British dominance in the Atlantic died in that cold May water. The resources that might have built more submarines were instead consumed by capital ships that spent the war hiding from British carriers. For the British, the victory was bittersweet. The Hood's destruction remained a raw wound in the national psyche. The crew of the Prince of Wales, who had fought bravely despite mechanical failures and inexperience, knew that their ship had been outmatched. They would have their revenge 7 months later when, ironically, that same ship would be sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers off the coast of Malaya, proving the lesson that the Bismarck's fate had taught. The Swordfish continued flying until 1945, remarkably surviving the entire war despite being obsolete before it began. The type served in every theater where the Royal Navy operated, adapting to roles its designers never imagined: night attack, radar-equipped anti-submarine patrol, even rocket-equipped ground attack. The string bag earned its nickname honestly. Like an old shopping bag, it could carry anything. But the Swordfish's most famous moment remained that evening in May 1941, when 15 canvas-covered biplanes challenged the mightiest battleship in the world and won. There is a tendency in military history to focus on the hardware, the tonnage, the gun calibers, the armor thickness, the top speed. These details matter, but they do not tell the whole story. The Bismarck was, by every measurable standard, a superior weapon system. She should have completed her mission. She should have devastated the Atlantic convoys. She should have changed the course of the war. Instead, she lies at the bottom of the Atlantic, a monument to the one variable that no engineer can quantify: human courage. The young men who flew those Swordfish into the teeth of the Bismarck's anti-aircraft fire did not have superior technology. They did not have the odds on their side. They had only their training, their determination, and their refusal to accept that the mission was impossible. That refusal, that stubborn insistence on trying even when the mathematics said failure was certain, is perhaps the most important lesson of the Bismarck's last voyage. The German admirals who dismissed carrier torpedo aircraft as fantasy were not stupid men. They were products of a system that valued analysis over intuition, data over daring. They looked at the capabilities of the Swordfish and saw a museum piece. They failed to see the men who would fly it. Admiral Lutyens, standing on the Bismarck's bridge as those ancient biplanes approached through the rain, had every reason to be confident. His ship was the most powerful afloat. His anti-aircraft batteries were formidable. The aircraft attacking him were slow, flimsy, and few. He had the numbers, he had the technology, he had the analysis. He lost anyway. And that is why, 80 years later, we still remember those 15 Swordfish and the men who flew them. Not because they had the best equipment or the most firepower, but because they demonstrated something that cannot be measured in specifications and statistics. They showed that in the great moments of history, the outcome is not determined by what you have. It is determined by what you are willing to do. The Bismarck's broken hull lies silent now, encrusted with rust, home to creatures that have never seen sunlight. The men who served aboard her have passed into memory. The Swordfish that crippled her have long since been retired. A few survivors preserved in museums where children peer at their fabric wings and wonder how anyone could have flown them in combat. But the story endures because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature. It reminds us that certainty is an illusion, that the carefully constructed walls of logic and probability can be breached by those who refuse to accept them. The admirals who called carrier torpedo strikes a fantasy were not wrong about the physics. They were wrong about the pilots. And that made all the difference. The waves of the North Atlantic still roll over the place where the Bismarck sank, indifferent to the drama that unfolded there. Ships still sail those waters, carrying cargo that sustains nations, oblivious to the wreck far below. The war that gave the Bismarck's death its meaning has passed into history, its veterans almost entirely gone, its lessons slowly fading from living memory. But on certain days, when the weather turns foul and the seas run high, the old sailors who remember say you can almost hear them. The drone of radial engines, the crack of anti-aircraft fire, the voices of young men doing what their enemies said could not be done. They were 20 years old, some of them. Flying machines made of wood and fabric, carrying torpedoes against the most powerful ship in the world. And they won. That is the story of the Bismarck and the Swordfish. That is why we remember. And that is why, when someone tells you something cannot be done, it is worth asking. According to whom? The admirals in Berlin were very certain. They were also very wrong. History is written by those who refuse to accept what the experts say is impossible. On May 26, 1941, 15 pilots in ancient biplanes wrote one of its most extraordinary chapters. The Bismarck was the future of naval warfare. The Swordfish were the past. But the past won. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all.